Hello, everyone. This is Robin with 7 questions. A heads up, this episode features some strong language, so listener discretion is advised. Now, on with the show. Welcome to 7 Questions, a Hear Your Story podcast using 7 questions from the Tell Your Life Story guided journal. Here we share the stories of people who've lived storied lives. That includes everyone, of course. But today we have Lameace HUSSAIN on the show. So let's get to know them, shall we? Hi there, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing very well, aside from the pre-show where I said that I couldn't get my hair sorted and it was stressing me out. But ultimately fine. Tell me about yourself. Tell me what you do.
So I am a herpetologist and a social scientist. So for those that don't know, a herpetologist is somebody who specifically studies amphibians and reptiles. So anything ranging from frogs to turtles to toads to snakes. And along with doing a lot of that stuff, I incorporate a lot of human dimensions into that. And so really understanding how people navigate through nature, what nature means to them, their experiences in being in the outdoors, or their experiences as scientists in the field. I just graduated with my PhD a couple weeks ago. So officially Dr. HUSSAIN.
Damn, we should redo the intro so I can say doctor. It's fun that you say the human side, because I was watching an interview with you and you said that your a big skill that you had that like have really taken you very far is your like ability to be social, or your ability to like be able to have that softer side of conversation. Tell me more about that. Like what is that something that you... I know it's the stereotype of like scientists and doctors to be fairly cold. Is it something that you're like, yeah, that's just true? And
no, it's definitely true. It's definitely true. And it's a very unfortunate reality. I think that it is a quality of like the old guard of scientists where they're not very good at talking to people, and they keep yelling at people that we need to change things, but they do it in a manner that people are like, you're like kind of rude. I don't want to engage with you. But I think a lot of us know that, in order to really get people to understand, like conservation initiatives, or for us to even really understand how things like climate change or development is impacting people, like you have to be able to like sit down and like talk to people. And to do that, you have to be able to build people's trust and make them feel comfortable, and so it takes a lot of finesse, and I think it takes a lot of empathy. And it's something that, like I teach a couple of classes at the University of Florida, and it's something that I tell students often of like, you're going to encounter people who don't trust you and who don't really care about frogs or about snakes, and that's fine, but you've got to really like understand where those perceptions come from. And in order to do that, you have to be able to talk to people. So. Yeah,
sure. Have there been any times where you've had someone be like, I don't want to say hostile, but like, very untrustworthy, and then after you specifically have been talking to them, they then come around and...
Yeah. So before I came to Florida to get my PhD, I was working for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife as a herpetologist. And, like quite often we were working with landowners, and some of the landowners like would pull weapons on us because they don't like the state. Damn. And they don't like the state for, like very valid reasons. But, and I always make this joke, but the number of landowners who have heard the one time that I went out fishing for salmon and that story just gets repeated over and over, because I'm like, I know that you're very untrusting of me because I'm working for the state.
Yeah.
And like that's fair. But I have nothing to do with elk conservation, right? Like I'm just
Yeah.
here like surveying for your frogs on your property. um, and a lot of times what we would do is you kind of like bring their guard down by being like, "Oh, like I saw that you had like this fishing boat out here, and like, you just talk to them about things that you know that they care about." And so within Washington, salmon fishing is, it's a huge thing. And like fisheries
Yeah.
out there is like the big kind of moneymaker. It brings a lot of people together because it's a big sport out there too.
Hmm.
And a lot of people are fishing salmon for sustenance. And so really kind of like telling these stories of like, oh, like I just went salmon fishing for the first time. And, they're like, oh, like, well, what'd you get? And I'm like, well, it was small, but like I got it, and
Yeah.
it really kind of like brings down those guards a lot. And it was a really good way too for us to be like, we hear these stories from salmon fishermen or like even like one of the tribes that we were working with that salmon populations were depleting in certain areas. And they're like,
Mm.
well, like when I was younger, we used to catch like however many salmon in a season, and now I can only catch like two.
Mm.
And so that also gives us an idea of how the landscape is changing and how those populations are changing. Um, and even though we were specifically kind of working with amphibians, it was also a good way to talk to landowners about like, good habitat for things like Western toads, because in Washington, these Western toads were actually breeding in these river channels in the Chehalis River Basin. And we're like, good habitat for those toads is actually good habitat for the salmon. And so you kind of connect it all back to something that they care
Mm.
about. And then it brings that guard down a little bit. And they kind of realize that like, you're just a technician working for the state.
um, Beautiful. I love you bringing up salmon fishing because that eases us real easy into our first question, which
Mhm.
is what makes you lose track of time because you love doing it so much?
Yeah, honestly, being outside, like I wasn't like a super outdoorsy kid or anything.
Mm.
When I was growing up, my mom's family had a farm, like a tobacco farm in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky. Um, and so we would go there on the weekends and like I would be outside there. But that was really my only exposure to being in the outdoors. Like I
Mm.
wasn't like a lot of other biologists who are in this field where like I grew up hunting or fishing or I grew up with my
Hmm.
parents taking me on hikes or anything. And I didn't really develop that kind of sense of wonder of wanting to be outside until I was a little older. Um, and I found now, especially because, like you get older and you become more aware of like the horrors that exist in the world. And I found that at some of my like darkest moments in my life, like the thing that helped me the most was being outdoors with friends.
Hmm.
And just sitting by a river or, like I'm down in Florida, so, tromping through the swamp with, just friends looking for frogs and stuff. And you really, you really kind of get to separate yourself from some of the things that are happening. And, you kind of get into this sense of like, this is it. Like this
Yeah.
is why like like all of this is worth it and stuff is just
Mm.
being around friends and being around friends in like an outdoor setting.
Mm. Was there a can you remember like a specific moment of you being like, "Ooh, I want to be a biologist. I want to look at frogs and snakes and amphibians like that." Do you remember a specific moment when it like clicked, or was it a thing that it's like you were drip fed this like passion throughout,
Hmm.
since childhood?
I feel like it was like a subtle thing when I was a kid. Like I said, I was always out on a tobacco farm and like there were snakes and frogs and stuff out there that I was
Sure.
like messing with, but it was never really something like even as a kid where I was just like, oh man, like I'm gonna grow up and I'm gonna be a scientist who
Yeah,
works
yeah,
with
yeah.
these things. And I grew up with a generation that also had like Steve Irwin on TV, and like I
Hmm.
thought all of that stuff was cool. But like, there was never a moment where I was just like, oh yeah, like this is a job that you could
This is
do.
what I
Because
want to do.
my
Yeah.
impression was like, if you wanted to work with animals, you were either going to be a vet, or you were going to work in a zoo. And I
Mm.
had no interest in doing either one of those things. Um, and honestly, like the weird thing that got me into biology is so my first degree is in psychology. And
Oh,
so
okay.
I was always entrenched with like people and stuff, and I was working as a research assistant after I had gotten my degree. And the projects that I was working on, like they were wonderful projects, but they were really heavy. And the person that I was seeing at the time, his dad was a forestry professor.
Mm.
And his dad was just like, and like he had gotten a degree in like a different field as well. And his dad was just like, like why don't you all try going back for wildlife? You like, being outside to an extent, like
Hmm.
why not try it? And I think at that point I was like, I need something else. Like this is like it's taking a toll on everything. And so I was like, all right, like, I'll try it. Why not?
Mm.
And so I I remember going back, and because I already had a bachelor's degree, I got to skip all of the like boring core classes that like undergrads have to take,
Yeah.
Um, and I specifically remember taking a herpetology class with this guy, Stephen Richter. And I always attribute him and his grad student at the time to being the reason why I got into this field because some of the other classes that I had taken, were like policy classes. And I was like, okay, yeah, like, this is kind of
Mm.
interesting, but like, I don't know, like how much longer, like I really want to do this or anything. Like none of this is like clicking that this is like
Yeah. Yeah.
a job or anything. And I remember taking a herpetology class. And we were out like doing just like these visual encounter surveys where you're flipping rocks and you're flipping logs. And I flipped a log over and there was a spotted salamander there. And it's like, in movies where things are like zooming in and the background's like zooming out and like there's like a bunch of stuff going on. It was like this weird, like aha moment as I looked at this like weird looking creature and like I held it and I was like, what the hell is this thing? Like, I had never seen a salamander before and like I'm in my 20s at this point and
Yeah.
I I just remember like talking to his grad student and I was like, well, like what is this? And he was like, oh yeah, like it's a spotted salamander and I was like, this thing's cool as hell. And he was like, yeah. And it was that moment. And I was just like, oh my God, like, wait, like, can I do this? And so I ended up talking to Dr. Richter and he was like, yeah, like the area that we were at, like I was thinking about doing this project, looking at these little vernal pools. So these pools that dry up in the summer that are
Mm.
made by ATV rets. And he was like, and I kind of want to see like what amphibians are breeding in those. And so I got to do that project and I was just like it was over after that. And like so, like I always tell students that like you never really know like what you're gonna do because
Yeah.
like I got into school and I was like no I'm gonna be a psychologist like this is what I'm gonna
Hmm.
do and granted like I came full circle back around to doing like human dimensions but it was really like a single class in college that I was just like oh like wait like people
I
do
love that.
this
Yeah.
like yeah
That's huge. That's so cool. I love that.
yeah
Do you have a I feel like it's rude to ask. Do you have a favorite of the amphibians that you've seen or
hmm
oh yeah, which one? Is it a spotted
Yeah.
salamander?
So I have two. I have two. I have one that's like my favorite because I've worked with it, and then I have another one that's my favorite because I saw it in the wild and like squeed like a 5-year-old kid. Um, so the first one is a rough-skinned newt. And these guys are found predominantly on the west coast of
Hmm.
the US, and they go all the way up into Canada. Um, And we were working with them with one of the projects that I was working on for Washington Fish and Wildlife.
Hmm.
And they're just these really, really cool little animals. So they're kind of like this brownish color on top with this bright orange underneath. And they have an attitude. And like, I say that because like they know that they're highly toxic. And so that whole genus, and really like newts in general, just like really toxic amphibians. And
Hmm.
Dorica granulosa, which was the specific newt that we were working with, is so toxic that only one thing can eat it, which is a common garter snake, which is really cool. But they emit tetrodotoxin, which is the same toxin that you get in like pufferfish and like blue ring octopus and stuff like
Wow.
that. And so they're just these like really cool little newts, and they just kind of walk around, and they're just like, you won't. You know, like you won't. Like, and so we would go up into these kind of like high alpine lakes to do these amphibian surveys, and like there were just some of these lakes that just had thousands of these newts in them, and they're just
Damn.
so funny to just kind of watch as they float in the water. So that one is probably my favorite as far as ones that I've worked with. I had the opportunity to go to Borneo last year for a
Mm-hmm.
conference for the World Conference or World Congress of Herpetology, which is like herpetologists from all over the world,
Cool.
like coming to this one conference to share what they're doing. And it was me and a couple of friends of mine who are also herpetologists. And we ended up going to this national park that was
Hmm.
near the conference. And we saw these Bornean horn toads. And I loved it so much that I got a tattoo of it on my leg. But they're these like big like they were bigger than what I thought they would be, but like they're these big toads with these kind of like pointy looking little horns right above their eyes,
Oh,
and they look
yeah.
cartoonish. Like
I love a
they're the most
freak. I love a
ridiculous
freak. This guy is great looking.
they're like the most ridiculous looking frog like I had ever seen. And like our guide, because we went out with a guide and stuff who was kind of talking to us about the forest, and like him and I were chit-chatting about some of like the local people and stuff around, and like what they're using some of the plants for.
Mm.
And he points down, and like I'm not seeing it, and everybody else is like freaking out. I was like, what are you all looking at? Even, and like finally somebody like gets down beside him, points it out, and it's just this giant frog, and I'm just like, oh my god, like this thing is just magnificent.
Oh, I love him. He's so spiky. That's
Yeah.
good. Yeah. Uh, I tell you, I said it before. I love a freak.
Yeah, yeah,
He's
they're
a
little
good-looking
freaks. Like
guy.
there's
Oh, that's cool looking. I'm a big fan.
yeah.
Right. Okay. Moving on to question two. We briefly mentioned that you grew up on a tobacco farm, but how would you describe your family when you were growing up?
Yeah. I had a great relationship with my parents. My dad is a truck driver, and so specifically when I was a kid, my dad was like a cross-continental truck driver. So he would
Oh,
only really
wow.
be home like, maybe once a month or something.
Mm.
So that made my time with him a lot more special when he did come home.
Mm.
My dad is from Baghdad, and so when I was a kid, like my dad's English was, it was really kind of like hard to understand for a lot of other people, but because I grew up with it, like
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
it wasn't difficult, for me. Um, and so me and my mom, were obviously really close because, she was around me a lot. As I got older, I think I really wanted more of, because I had been around my mom's family a lot, and my mom's family,
Hmm.
like I said, is from like deep Kentucky, and like the women specifically on her side of the family are these really like rough and tumble like Appalachian women and stuff. And so
Yeah.
it was a good like role model, like to have as a kid. But I really wanted, like to get a lot more in tune with like my dad's side of the family. Um, and really understand a lot about, like the culture and like things that he
Hmm.
did like when he was a kid. And when I was probably like 7 or 8, my grandparents came here from Baghdad to come visit.
Mm.
And I have this just like adorable photo of me just like staring up like at them, and it's so cute, and it's one of my favorite photos that I have of me as a kid with them and my parents, in the background. And um, it was it was really interesting, and it really made me appreciate a lot of things, I think, as a kid, because my dad had some family that was in Kentucky at the time,
Mm.
which is where I grew up. And so we would go over when he was in town. And as I should preface, like when I got older, around like end of middle school, early high school, my dad had taken a job where he was home like a lot more. And
Mm.
so during the time of being like a teenager, we would go over to his uncle's house a lot. And so I was exposed a lot to the food and to like the culture and like, the aesthetic and the smells and
Mm.
stuff of being, Iraqi. And it's something that's really stuck with me, I think, for a long time. And and of course, like every time that we would plan, like, okay, like maybe because my dad would go back and visit every year, and he still
Mm.
does. And I think every time we would plan for me to go back there, there was something major that was going on in the world. And so it
Sure.
ended up not being, it didn't work out in the cards. And I think the last time I was supposed to go with him was in 2020, and then COVID hit. So,
Oh my God.
yeah. But
Heinous.
yeah, like family wise, I think my parents did the best that they could.
Yeah.
I'm close with my parents now. They're, very sweet people. But yeah.
Love that. What we mentioned what your dad does. What does your mother do?
My mom is I feel like I don't know like her exact title. She works so when I was growing up, she was an accountant at like
Oh, cool.
a small business, and now she's like a secretary for like a larger construction company. And like my
Oh,
mom
fun.
like went to college for like a semester, and then
Sure.
that was all. My parents met because my mom was like teaching my dad how to speak English. So
Oh, that's cute. Oh, that's so cute. Love that actually. Oh my God, that's so nice. Um, did they? So they both went to the same college then.
Yeah.
I imagine that's cool. That's cute. Um, right. So, hopping off of the talking about your family. Question number 3 is: who was the first person in your life who truly understood you and made you feel like you didn't have to explain or justify yourself?
Man, this is a good question.
Is a big deep
I,
one.
I feel like I mean, maybe not all queer kids, but like most queer kids, when I was in high
Yeah.
school, I was brooding a lot, right? I was going through like a real rebellious stage of just like kind of being an asshole, like to my parents and stuff. Being like, nobody understands me. And, um, I remember my freshman year of high school. I was in a science class, and there was a girl sitting next to me who had bowling shoes on, and she had like a Green Day shirt on with like fishnets like underneath the shirt. And I was like, man, this
Hell
person
yeah.
looks cool. Um, and then we got separated. Like, we got separated from the other class into a smaller classroom, like to a
Hmm.
smaller biology class for some reason. Um, and like I remember walking into that class and just like being terrified, like, and being like, man, like I'm not gonna be able to like make any friends. And I saw
Hmm.
her, and like I walked up to her and I was like, hey, I'm gonna sit next to you and be your friend because you're gothic looking. And she was just like,
Ah!
all right, cool. And that person is my best friend Laura, and we've been friends ever since.
No way! Oh
Yeah,
my
and
God.
she's definitely throughout my whole life, Laura has definitely been the person that, I've never really needed to explain anything to her. Like, she gets it. And, even the times where I just feel like the world just feels like it's stacked, against me, or like I don't know, like, like what my identity is or like where I belong. Like Laura was always the person that I could go to about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as I've gotten older, I've definitely had other friends in my life who've been the same. So when I was working for Washington Fish and Wildlife, I met, my friends Amber, Casey, and one of my other best friends, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
And they were also people that, like there was no need to hide like who you
Yeah.
were or anything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think when I came out as being non-binary, they were all very much just like, yeah, like, okay, there
Love.
was no like questioning or like pushback like against it or anything. And the friends that I eventually made here in Florida, including like, my roommate Danny and my best friend Wesley, are also people that, akin to Laura. Like there's never been a moment where I feel like I can't, like
Mm-hmm.
be unapologetically myself. But I attribute all of that to her, and like being able, like in the peak of being like a broody teenager, like finding somebody else who was also brooding at the time. It was just like, yeah, like,
That's so cute. I do. I mean, you said still best friend of all time. However, I know that you've moved around a lot. You're currently in
mhm.
Florida. You were in Washington. Um, do you? I mean, it seems so. Do you find it super easy to you move to a new place and then it's like I'm just gonna make friends now, or is there ever
Yeah.
that point of, ugh, I want to be with people I know?
Yeah, I mean, when I moved to Florida, it was very difficult for me at first. Like I
Mm-hmm.
was absolutely terrified. So when I was in Washington, I had gone through a divorce, and so
Mm.
Amber, Casey, and Chris were these people that like really helped me, find myself and like get back to who I was, because I
Mm-hmm.
felt like for so long I had really stifled, like a huge part of myself. And so thinking about like, oh God, like now I'm gonna leave this. I'm gonna leave, like this family that I
Yeah.
made in Washington and move to Florida, a state that's arguably a lot more red than Washington. I
As
had like
as a
I was
queer
like,
person going to Florida
yeah,
is horrifying.
yeah. And I was like, I grew up in Kentucky, like maybe it can't be like that much worse. It yeah. So I was really nervous, but I have this mantra of just kind of like you just fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you're
Yep. Yep.
meeting
Yep.
people,
Yep.
you're
Yep.
like, you
Yep.
know what?
Yep.
We're just gonna be unapologetically ourselves. We're just gonna see where that gets us. And my roommate Danny started the same time I did, so we ended up being really close friends when I first started, and I met a lot of other people, and um, I think that it, as scary as it is, because like right now I'm looking for professor positions, and a lot of them are in a lot of
Mhm.
different states, and so you're like, all right, like we're gonna go through this again, but I find that you just kind of have to just take a leap and just hope for the
Yeah.
best. I did a lot
Yeah.
of queer speed friending when I was down here. So the Pride Center put on
Oh,
like these
sure.
queer
Sure.
speed
Sure.
friending
Yeah.
events. And so like that was fun. And that kind of helped, meet people who were kind of like in the same like
Oh,
group
yeah.
and stuff.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah. Um. Beautiful. No, perfect. Love it. I that moving to a new city and doing a like a queer friend speed dating thing is a story I know so well. Um.
have you done it too?
Yeah, I've done it lots. Yeah, I like from London originally,
Hmm.
in the UK, and then I moved to Cardiff in Wales, and then I've moved to Toronto, which is where I currently am. But then I moved to Brooklyn, and then I've moved back to Toronto, and it's like there's a lot of like I'm gonna go make some friends because I have to. I'm in a new place. No, I get it. That is a story I know very well. I hope you're enjoying this conversation with Lameace as much as I am, and I hope you've enjoyed your year as well. As it comes to an end, if you're looking to reflect on how this year has gone and others also, might I recommend Tell Your Life Story Journal. It just so happens that the questions from this podcast are pulled directly from that source. You can get it on our website, plus in a variety of local gift shops, as well as Target, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, and even more. As I always say, everyone has a story worth sharing. Why not share yours as well? All right, question number 4. What period of your life shaped you the most, and how did it change you? Because we've talked about the class that you went to, where it was kind of like a light switch moment. But I'm wondering if there's you've also moved a lot. I'm wondering if one of those are the story. If there's something else hidden period of your life that shaped you the most.
Yeah, I would say there are 4 like distinct like canon events that I call them, that kind of shaped like my trajectory. I my last name's Hussein, and I was in middle school when 9/11 happened. And so navigating being in a place like Kentucky and being Middle Eastern, growing up with my dad being Muslim, it was hefty. It was hefty. Yeah. Like the bullying was a lot. And so those kinds of canon events that happened in middle school and high school, I think shaped my viewpoint of like empathy towards other groups, because naturally, like when things like that happen, you look for people who are like you, right? Like you look for people who kind of like share these experiences and stuff like that to like build that type of community. And so I think that's where like that kind of started. The next one, I think the one that kind of shifted me into changing out of psychology and going to, wildlife, like not just the class, but when I was a research assistant, some of the projects we were working on were dealing a lot with women who were pregnant and might not be in the safest situations in their home. And I remember having a case where I was talking to the girl, and it was the realization of like how young she was and all of these things that were happening. And when I got done talking to her and I went into my boss's office and I was like, we've got to do something. Like you can't just like, this can't just be like part of a study. Right. Yeah. And she was just like, there's nothing we could do. That's not our job. And I was just like, damn, like the system is really failing like a lot of these people that we're talking to. And like, the studies were designed to show that these like state appointed facilities and programs were working. And it's like, they're working, but there's always going to be, there's always going to be people who are falling through the cracks. And a lot of those people who are falling through the cracks need it the most. And so I think it made me very hesitant towards, I think my viewpoints of like government support and like how much the government actually cares about people. And so that started shifting things a little bit. And then I got into wildlife. And then in 2019, I got divorced, and like not a decision I regret or anything like that.
No, of course.
And during that period of time, like after I got divorced, the field crew that I was on was all women. And I was like, thank God, we need this right now. And I was doing a lot of outreach events for Washington Fish and Wildlife. And one of the outreach events that I did was with this group called Girls Without Limits. And it was a really cool group. And we went there and, we were talking to them about snakes and like women and wildlife and stuff like that. And I had a girl come up to me and she told me that I didn't look like the scientist that she was expecting scientists to look like. And I was like, okay, what do you mean by that? Right? Yeah. And she showed me a book of Jane Goodall. And I was like, okay. And I was like, okay, well, one, at least it's a woman, first of all. But two, I was like, okay. And like it dawned on me that, like this girl is young, she's, a woman of color and
Mm-hmm.
I was like, well, like, anybody can be a scientist. Like, you don't have to look like Jane Goodall to be a scientist. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to be British to be a scientist or,
Yeah.
blonde and blue-eyed to be a scientist. And she asked me, she was like, do you work with people who look like me? And I was like, yeah, because like at the time, like my field crew did, have
Yeah. Yeah.
a lot more diversity than a lot of the other, like groups in the department. I was like, yeah, like we have people who work at Fish and Wildlife who look like you. And I came back to the office and I remember talking to somebody about it of like whether or not we had the demographics of, like who was working
Mm-hmm.
there. And at the time of all of the employees that were in the state working for Washington Fish and Wildlife, 11 or less of them were Black. And I, I guess as somebody who just assumed like I'm never gonna run into a queer Iraqi person, like working
Yeah.
in this field, it didn't, it was something that like I wasn't really thinking about and like, definitely like, should have noticed but didn't. But I was just like, damn, like had I been honest with this young girl of like, no, like there's hardly anybody that I work with who
Yeah.
look like
Yeah.
you, like, but you never want to like smash a kid's ambition or anything like
No
that.
way. Yeah. Yeah.
And like the women that we were showing, most of them did look like her because we were trying to show that there was a diversity of
Mm-hmm.
scientists. And so then it really started hitting me that a lot of these DEI initiatives that, like Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife that I was a part of and stuff like that, um, they fall short on a lot of things. And
Mm-hmm.
so that really jump started my PhD. And Nia Morales, who is my advisor, was specifically working on these things of how marginalized groups feel like in this
Mm-hmm.
field and stuff. And so that was the real big kind of canon event that led to the research that I did with my PhD. I'm really advocating for those spaces. And yeah, and I think the last canon event honestly has just been teaching. So
Mm-hmm.
I've taught the entirety of my PhD and I love it. And like the number of students that just like feel safe enough to talk to you about things that they're obviously not going to talk to every professor about and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
It definitely makes me think that I'm doing it right. So
Yeah.
that's good.
No, yeah, that's nice. That you talking about the being in Washington and this all female team. It's something that like I have felt where I have worked with like a very diverse team and then I would leave to join another team and then the like the feeling of even if it's the same setting shifts so much.
Hmm.
And I can imagine that there is some. Actually, I don't know. Is there any point when you're like, I kind of wish I was back with my all female team? And
Yeah, I get the question a lot of like whether or not I would ever like go back to Washington.
mm-hmm,
Um, and I personally love being in the South. Like, I
mm-hmm,
grew up in Kentucky and like though Kentucky has its flaws, Kentucky also had a lot of diversity where I was.
yeah,
And you miss out on a lot of that in places like Washington because places like Washington and Oregon have historically had a lot of laws in place that did limit the diversity that was in those
mm-hmm,
states. And so although they're they're very progressive and liberal with a lot of things, you don't like you're in a bubble almost,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
like
yeah,
you really don't get to see or hear a lot of these diverse perspectives. And you get a lot of like indigenous perspectives, which is really good, like out west.
yeah,
But then you also think about the history of like, well, why do we have so many tribes that are out west
mm-hmm,
and not on the East
mm,
Coast, right?
mm,
Like, why do we have so much more diversity in the South versus, like in the Pacific Northwest?
yeah,
And like as nice as like the politics are and stuff in places like Washington or California, the the stories and the diversity in the community that you get in places in the South, like
Yeah.
you really can't, you
Oh,
can't beat
yeah.
it, you
I
know?
my my friend, she's from North Carolina and has been
hmm
her whole life. She is a black gay woman. And then when everything was getting really rough, she had a lot of people ask like, um, people just be like, "Oh, well, you should move somewhere else." Like, there's a lot of people in like New York or Brooklyn, and there's just like a lot of people in like the more northern states. And her only response, I was there when she said it, and it just stuck with me so much. Is like, you wouldn't get it. She's like, I'm not leaving.
Yeah.
You wouldn't get it. And it's that thing of. I don't know. It's like, yeah, this is home though. There's more community here, and we have
Yeah.
history here, and it's like I'm not leaving just because things are getting rough. You wouldn't get it.
Well, and like my thing is always like, we've had a lot of faculty leave, like University of Florida, for instance,
Hmm.
because of all of the hellscape that's happening in Florida.
Yes, the horrors.
But I think like my thing is always, if people leave, then there's nobody here. And like, especially as
Yeah.
somebody who is, a teacher and who provides these spaces for a lot of students who don't have the means to move out of the state,
Hmm.
right? And so they need a bulldog. They need somebody there who's just like, no, like I'll go to bat for you. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I think you make like obviously the South has a lot of really bad history that, like maybe most of the US doesn't
Yeah.
like
There's a
have.
reason
And
why it is more
yeah,
diverse
there's a
there.
reason
Yeah.
why it is the way it is, but I to me it's one of those things like if everybody leaves then they win. And I just
Yeah.
refuse to let that
Yeah.
happen.
No. Good. Yeah. Absolutely. No, I totally get that. All right. We're in the last two questions where we get a little heavier.
Uh,
Um, what's the question you're afraid to ask yourself?
I think the question that I'm always afraid to ask myself is what's stopping you? Like, I
Oh,
think
sure.
about, yeah, like I think about things like, like I wish I could just like maybe go to this conference or maybe like ask to like
Mm,
help out on something, but I'm like, I don't want to be like a burden or like I don't want to come
hmm.
off as like a certain way. And then I think like the question that I always need to ask myself, but I'm afraid to is like, well, what's stopping you? And then
Yeah.
like at a certain point, like what's the worst that could happen?
Hmm.
Like for asking for something. And so I think those are really the questions that I get afraid to ask myself sometimes, but
Yeah.
that I need to ask myself a lot of times.
Was that ever kickstarted by something? Was there something that you like wanted to do, didn't end up doing, and then you just like consistently regretted, and you just keep asking yourself, like, what was stopping me doing that?
Yeah, I mean, all the time. I think, uh, being younger and just always kind of being afraid to take risk or like, getting in trouble a lot for things like
Sure.
kind of really stifles you, right? Or like not wanting to get into arguments with like partners or friends, that
Oh,
stuff
sure.
when
Yeah.
you're young really like sets a standard, and
Hmm.
then like you don't do it and then you're just like shit. And I look on things like, now and I'm just like, man, my 20s could have been a lot cooler. Like I was, just not afraid to do things and, just ask myself like, what's really stopping you like from doing this,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those things where it's like the hindsight is what you have to remember
yeah,
going forward. Is like, no, what's stopping you? You got to do it.
yeah,
No, I
yeah.
yeah, no, I get that. Right. Question number 6. If you could ensure that your life and work would accomplish one thing, what would you want that thing to be?
I think, and it's something that I feel like I try to do as an instructor with all my students is
Hmm.
just really instilling this idea of community and empathy and like the
Mm.
need for diverse perspectives and the understanding that people are walking different, different paths. And
Mm-hmm.
because of that, they have different life experiences. And like, you have to be able to listen to those and you have to be able to have uncomfortable conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, a lot of people that I've given like guest lectures to or, a lot of students, like you're worried about having those conversations, right? Because, you don't want to come off, you don't want to say the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the fact of the matter is like you can't learn. You can't move forward. You can't build yourself as a better person until you have those conversations. And so I think really I hope that people build empathy, that they have difficult
Mm-hmm.
conversations. A lot of the work I did for my PhD was centered on sexual harassment in the field. And, ideally, it would be nice to see like some actual change come of that instead of just like, no, yeah, like we take this seriously. It's like, yeah, you and everybody else, but it's still happening. So clearly,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
clearly like there are these like societal systems in place that allow for things like that to keep happening. And I think a lot of times it's because people don't want to learn. They don't want to have these difficult conversations. They don't want to be like empathetic towards
Yeah.
people's lived experiences. So
There is a thing of like, oh, I acknowledge that it's a thing that's happening, and it's like, okay, but what's happening though? Like, what are we doing
yeah,
to stop it happening? Like, what are we doing to
exactly.
help improve the situation, or are we just saying, oh, I hear you, and it's like, yeah, but you're not though, are you? You're just saying those
Yeah.
words. Yeah.
And one of the biggest things with the work that we did was we get a lot of people, especially in academia, who's just like, well, like harassment doesn't happen in my lab, and it's like, okay, well, that's great, like I'm proud of you, but like
Yeah. Cool.
that, like, are you taking the things that you do in your lab to ensure that that stuff's not happening, and are you bringing it to conferences that you're going to? Are you bringing it into other spaces that you're going to?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A big thing that we see with, men in the field often is, well, people are having these conversations, but like I just get up and walk away, or like I just don't engage in it. And it's like, right, but when you get up and you walk away or you don't engage, you're reinforcing these notions that people can still talk like that, right? And
Yeah.
so it's having an uncomfortable conversation of being like, hey, like that's gross. Like you shouldn't say
Yeah.
things
Don't
like
do
that,
that. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Absolutely. Um. Okay. Final question.
Yeah.
Um, kind of a final question. We have there's an extra one in this question itself. What question do you wish someone would ask you about your life? And the additional question is, I'm just going to ask you it after. So,
Hmm. I think I don't know. Like I guess maybe if all of the experiences have been worth it, like have all
hmm
of the career changes and have all of those like kind of harsh realities been worth it in the end, or like
mm,
how they've built me as a person.
sure. What? Why that question? Do you feel like? Do you have a small like seed in you that you're like scared that it hasn't? Or are you like, do you
No,
really think it has and you want to talk about how it has?
I think it has. And I think often, like and especially students that we get, right? Like they see that you're a biologist and they're like, oh, like you must have just like, you've always known you're a biologist.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
you know, and I don't know, like I think it's interesting to know that somebody that, is teaching you or maybe you look up to or somebody you're working with, like didn't have the same path that you did, and I
Yeah.
think I think that's just important. And I think it's just a beautiful way to tell people like there are multiple paths in this life that lead us to do different things. And I
hmm
think the reason why I like telling my story so much is because I didn't get into wildlife like when I started really like hammering into it because I grew up loving frogs or anything, right? Like I started
Yeah.
off working with people and loving people, and that never faded. Um,
Hmm.
sorry, my cat's pulling on my
That's okay.
that never faded. Like I definitely, I found this new love with amphibians and reptiles, but I was always doing outreach and I was always interacting with people. And to come full circle with my research of working with women who are in
Mm.
these horrid situations, or, working with people who just were in these situations where they were stuck and the system's failing them, to then coming full circle and having a whole dissertation centered on how our science system and those systems in place have failed women and have failed minorities. It's an interesting kind of full circle moment, I think. And
Mm.
I think it's cool for students to, learn that like you you're not necessarily the animal that you work with, right? Like you have a
Yeah,
whole
yeah,
story like behind you that
yeah.
got you there. And just because your family didn't take you hiking as a kid, just because like you weren't into camping or because you weren't super outdoors doesn't, like make you any less of a scientist, or doesn't make your path to this field like any less valid.
Mm. I also think there's a weird like offshoot of that, which it's pretty powerful to there might be someone in your class who is like, oh well, this I've wanted to do this since I was a kid, or this is a thing that like I'm interested
Hmm.
in. Hearing you talk about, well, this like I was doing something else before I started doing this,
Yeah.
and then maybe realizing, oh, maybe there is something else that like then they get passionate about something, and then feeling okay to be like, well, I'm going to use all the tools and the knowledge I have from this, and I'm going to put it into this other field,
Hmm.
and then going to come at it from a very unique perspective, just like you did.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think there's something cool and powerful in that. That's a thing I really like.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, that's it for all of our questions. We did it. You solved my questions puzzle. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Just before we head off, is there, if someone was interested maybe to learn more about you or the things that you do, would you have anywhere to direct them? Or would you have anyone even watch a thing that you particularly like, even if you don't have like somewhere specific to lead them to?
Yeah, I mean, I have social media, I have my Instagram, I have my Blue Sky. If people ever have questions about, a frog or a turtle in your area, or you want to know any of that, people can always shoot me an email. It's lhussain1@ufl.edu. I'm always open to conversations about anything. If you want to tell me a cool story about how you found a frog as a kid, or you're just like, man, I don't know, whoa, what are these bugs about? Like yeah, I'm always open to conversations about stuff like that.
Beautiful. Love it. Well, perfect. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate you.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. This podcast was possible due to listeners like you. The inspiration funds of Hear Your Story and our amazing team. Our producer, Madeline Mason. Our social media video and transcription editor, AJ Ray. Our video editor, Adrian Parker. Our copywriter, Parker Robbins. Our post-production supervisor and graphic designer, Abby Kelly. Our creative art director, Chelsea Jewell. And myself, Robin Eckberg, as your host and audio editor. Thank you for joining us, and remember to share your story.